All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tableau Conference 2016 and to Intersecting, Interactivity, the official guide to legends, filters, highlighters, parameters, and actions. So my name's Tim Hughes. I'm a systems product consultant here at Tableau. Just means my job is to help people like you evaluate our software, learn how to use it. I know there's a couple people in the room, at least a couple of our Seattle customers I've worked directly with. Hi, Beth. And one of my greatest passions about Tableau is the fact that you can make it interactive. So I want to start with that as a question. Why even bother with interactivity at all? So interactivity engages your audience better than static reports, which means greater adoption of your content. Interactivity allows your audience to answer second-level questions, which means fewer change requests. And interactivity allows you to build one multifaceted dashboard instead of multiple single-use static reports, which means less work for you. So interactivity is good for your end users and good for you. So today we're going to be specifically talking about some of the tools we have for interactivity. The controls in Tableau. The control is a technical term for it. So those are filters, highlighters, legends, parameters, and actions. Then we'll actually develop a decision tree composed of a set of questions that we can ask to help us figure out what interactive control will be most appropriate for what we need. And then we'll run through 3 case studies that build upon one another and put that decision tree into action. But before we do that, I do have a couple of disclaimers. So this presentation is premised on Tableau 10.0 or later. Earlier versions do not include some of the essential features that we'll be using in our discussion, namely the data highlighter. If you do not have a version 10.0 or later, you should download it. If your organization does not allow that, I'm very sorry. The other disclaimer is that many things are possible through creative data structuring, either in Tableau or via an ETL tool or process. In this session, we won't be talking about what creative data structuring can do for interactivity. We're going to be keeping it simple. So with that, let's start with a summary of the controls that we have in Tableau, our tools for interactivity. So the first control we're going to talk about is filters. So the use case for filtering is to narrow the scope of analysis. So here I'm looking at tuberculosis rates by country. And if I want to narrow my scope of analysis, I could say, well, let's only look at tuberculosis rates in the more recent years. Right? I can filter and only pick the range of data that's appropriate to what I want to look at. I can also drill into maybe one or more regions if I just want to look at, say, Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. I can narrow the scope down to Africa, Eastern Mediterranean. That'll make a lot more sense. So I can narrow the scope down to just the segment of the world that I want to take a look at. Right, so each time I'm sending a query that's returning fewer rows of data, narrowing my scope to only what I want to see. Right, so this has a number of benefits, which is that we can drill into a specific subset of data, or the other way of thinking about that is you can exclude irrelevant data. And then we can multi-select. Here I'm selecting multiple years of data and multiple geographic regions. And I have multiple UI options. Right, so I have a slider, a drop-down. I also have lists, text entry. So a filter is very flexible in those regards in that I can choose one or more selections and also UIs. The only drawback of a filter really is not so much of a drawback as it is by design, which is that it removes the context provided by comparing the subset of the data that we're looking at to all of the data. Right, so in this case, if I'm just looking at Africa, right, Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, I see that I have values ranging from 1 to 43%. Dark red is 43%. As an example, if I look at something else, if I look at, say, Europe, then it looks a little different, right? I still get light to dark, but now that dark red represents 25% because I've removed the context of the rest of the countries. So really, it looks like, if we drill in here, that Turkmenistan has a 25% fatality rate, and that looks horrible, but it's not nearly as bad as what we saw in Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean because we removed that context. Now, there are ways to correct for this in this particular example. I could fix the color legend to be between 0 and 100%, or 0 and 50%, or whatever my upper range is. But those are accommodations you have to keep in mind when you're doing this. And think about whether the goal here is to see what the highest percentage fatality rate is within a selected region, or to keep those fatality rates represented consistently across regions. It's all a matter of what your end goal is. All right, so that's our first control. The second control we're going to discuss is highlighters. Now, the data highlighter is new in version 10.0. Raise your hand if so quick poll, raise your hand if you've used the data highlighter since version 10.0 came out. OK, a few people. I'll take that with a grain of salt. Polling's not an exact science. So we need better data, it's true. So for those who are not familiar with the data highlighter, the purpose of the data highlighter, the use case, is to find data within the context of a larger data set. So this is, in a sense, the exact opposite of a filter, in that the filter narrowed the context, got rid of the context, and narrowed the scope. Here, we're keeping the scope and saying, show me Afghanistan, right? So if I select Afghanistan, I can see Afghanistan in the context of all the other countries. Right, so this allows me to draw conclusions like compared to other countries, Afghanistan doesn't have a lot of per capita deaths or per capita incidence of tuberculosis. Right, I can say, looking up here, Central African Republic has many more, and American Samoa and down to the far left has not many at all. So the big benefit here is I get that context. Now, there are some drawbacks, which the data highlighter, as it was released in version 10.0, is single select only, it's drop-down only, and probably most importantly, it always highlights all worksheets in the dashboard. So note that in the bar chart on top, everything is grayed out. Now, I know Afghanistan would be included in the Eastern Mediterranean region, but that region is not highlighted because country is not on the view in that bar chart. So across all worksheets, the data highlighter is going to identify where that one particular dimension, in this case country, is, and highlight country. If country, or whatever dimension you're using, is not present in that worksheet, the entire worksheet will be grayed out, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something you have to make sure people expect. I may not want to highlight a region when someone's expecting to highlight a country and get them to falsely conclude that the value for the Eastern Mediterranean is the same as the value for Afghanistan. All right, so the next control we're going to talk about is not actually a control in its own right, but legends are used to encode data primarily. In this case, I have a color encoding here that shows the different countries from that same scatter plot before by color. Now, this is helpful in determining that I can see there's a lot of orange at the upper right, which means the countries in Africa make up the bulk of the countries in this upper right quadrant. Now, where this becomes interactive is I can call greater attention to that by using a legend to highlight. So I can just select Africa and say, show me all of Africa. And then it's very clear that everything in the upper right is from Africa. Right? Or show me the Americas. And again, because I'm highlighting and not filtering, I'm getting the context. I can see all of the countries in the Americas are pretty much in the lower left, with Haiti as that mild outlier. So the benefits of a legend is that legends help users to understand data. That's their primary use case, to encode data through color or shape or size. But as a bonus, you get to highlight, but that's on discrete values only. Here I have discrete colors for discrete countries, I can't highlight on a continuous color spectrum because it's not a selection tool with a slider or anything like that. So highlighting for discrete values only, but that's a nice bonus. The drawbacks here are that legends are not appropriate for high cardinality fields. And what I mean by that is legends are not appropriate for fields that have a large number of distinct values. So here I'm using region on color, and there's only 6 regions, so the human mind is pretty good at distinguishing between 6 different colors. If I were to put country on here instead, I'd have, 200 around there different colors, or worse, repeated colors. The human mind can't distinguish between 200 colors at once, and it also gets confused when you repeat colors. So that would be a really bad idea for a legend, to put country on color. Just because it wouldn't be helpful, it'd actually be more confusing. It would detract from the point you're trying to make about distribution. So just one thing to keep in mind, though, legends are good for low cardinality. Cardinality meaning the number of distinct values in that field. So the next control we're going to talk about is parameters. So parameters are used for driving calculations, sets, and reference lines. And through that, we can actually imitate other functionality. So as an example, I have a parameter here that's been loaded with all the country values. And if I select, say, Argentina, I can imitate highlighting and filtering. So in the scatter plot, it looks like I'm highlighting, but really what's happening is I have a calculation that just detects if my selection equals the country and then colors by that. So I'm not highlighting, I'm just coloring dark blue and really, really light grayish blue. Similarly, down below, I'm not technically filtering with the parameter. What I'm doing is using that same calculated field that tests if the parameter value equals the country value and filtering to only rows of data that match. So that I'm not filtering on the parameter, I'm filtering on the calculated field that involves the parameter. But the point here is that the parameter is flexible enough because I can include it in a calculated field or a set or a reference line. I can link that parameter to multiple calculated fields across multiple data sources and then imitate these types of interactivity, plus more. So it's very customizable. And we get one interactive element to control multiple effects, in this case, both filtering and highlighting with the same selection. The drawbacks of parameters are that they're single select only. I can only select one value at a time. Also, the values are static. So in this case, I've loaded that parameter with all the country values. I would say that's an appropriate use case for parameters because countries don't change terribly often, at least not every day or every week. But if you had a situation where you want to do something similar for, say, customers, if you wanted a customer scorecard to see how a certain customer compares to others and then filter to that customer's purchases over time, hopefully your customers are updating on a regular basis. Otherwise, you have bigger problems. Right? At least once a quarter, you're hoping you're getting new customers. And you probably don't want to go in and manually reload those values into the parameter every quarter. Right? So parameters are static. That is probably their greatest drawback. But really, it means they're just appropriate for certain uses and not others. OK, the last control we're going to talk about is actions. So the use case for actions is to create interactive data elements. So in this dashboard here, I have an overall view of tuberculosis deaths by region. And then I can see how that's trending over time for the world. Now, if I hover over Africa, I can watch my selection change below, right? Hover over Southeast Asia, see that change, Eastern Mediterranean, Western Pacific, Europe, Americas. So instead of going through a drop-down or a list or a slider, I'm directly interacting with the view. And that's the big benefit, is direct interactivity. That direct interactivity also means that I get increased dashboard data density. And what that means is instead of taking up valuable screen real estate with a long selection list or a slider or something like that, that screen real estate is occupied by worksheets that actually convey information about the data. In this case, the information conveyed about the data is the overall value, right? Overall, there's 1,026 deaths per 1 million people per year in Africa. This informs my selection before I even make my selection. That's a huge benefit. The other benefit here is that although in this example I'm only filtering, actions can be configured to both filter and highlight, and actually to link to a web page. So just like parameters, I get one interactive element to control multiple effects. Now, the only drawback of an action is that they're not always apparent to the end user, especially end users who are not terribly familiar with Tableau don't know that you can design every element in Tableau to be interactive. So they just may not know. But you can accommodate that by providing instructions. So here I'm saying in the title, yearly tuberculosis deaths, hover to drill in italics. And this is just my personal preference. I always put suggestions or commands in italics with a dot, dot, dot. It makes it more intriguing. People are like, oh, I should try that. That's a great idea. Thank you for the suggestion. Right. You can also put that in the tooltip so that as someone is casually mousing over someone and that pops up, they'll say, wait, what was that? So there are ways to encourage someone to interact with the view. Right? People are pretty used to drop-downs and radial selections. They see that as something that will be interactive. They're maybe not aware that the view itself will be interactive. So we need to encourage that. OK, so those are the 5 controls we have available to us to build interactivity in Tableau. Now, I ran through all the different use cases, the benefits, the drawbacks. The question is, how do you decide when to use what? So to that end, we're going to develop a decision tree off of a bunch of questions. So our first question has to do with purpose. What is the effect you want the selection to have? So in this case, we can choose between filtering. Right? I could say just filter to Africa. I could say I want to highlight, not to filter. And I could say let's highlight a country in Africa, Angola. And then I could also say, well, what I really want to do is change the threshold that qualifies as a low fatality rate to something different and change this reference line and this calculated field. So those are the decisions, my options for purpose. Do I want to filter, highlight, or drive a calculation set or reference line? And if we look at what can do, which control we can use for which purpose, an action is able to filter and highlight. A filter is able to filter. A highlight is able to highlight. A legend is able to highlight as well. And a parameter is able to do all 3. Right? So when we're thinking about purpose, we can start to narrow down our choices. The next question we can ask has to do with encoding. So would the selection values be useful as a data element, meaning not just a drop-down or a radial selection, but something that actually conveys information about my selection before I make my selection? So I could say, no, I don't need the selection to encode data. Right? I don't need to know anything about my selection before I make my selection. So if I just want to say, no, I live in Africa, I just want to look at Africa, right? This could be extended to if you have like a sales team dashboard, and the sales manager only just wants to see how his or her team is doing. They don't care about the other teams. They don't necessarily need to know which teams are doing the best. They just need to know if they're doing well enough. So just having a drop-down selection for team would be appropriate, because that selection doesn't need to be informed by data. It's informed by the fact that it's that manager's team. But I could also say, yeah, the selection would benefit from data encoding. It would be nice to know which region has the highest overall value before I select it. And then I can see how that value changed over time. So if we do answer yes, that we need data encoding, we can do data encoding with actions, because then we're actually using worksheets in a dashboard rather than a drop-down or anything like that. We can also use legends if we just want to do color encoding. Color encoding is still data encoding. We're still telling the end user something about the view through color, but we're just not conveying numeric information. Right? But we can use actions and legends to encode data. If we say, no, I don't need that, then we can actually use any of the elements here. Right? We can build an action that doesn't look like data encoding and still use it. So the next question we're going to ask has to do with selection. So do we want to select more than one value at a time? So I could say, no, I just want to do a single select. I want to drill into a single region at a time. Right? I'll just choose Africa. But I could also say, yeah, I do need to do multi-select. What I really want to be able to do is select a range of dates, a range of years, not just a single year. Right? So do I need to be able to select one value or more than one value? So if I want to just select a single value, I can use any of the controls. If I want to select multiple values, I can use any of the controls except for parameters. Right? And that's one of the drawbacks we talked about with parameters. They're single select only. The next question we can ask has to do with scope. So which worksheets in the dashboard will the selection affect? I could say I want my selection to affect all worksheets. So if I highlight Andorra, right, I'm affecting all worksheets. That's why the line chart grays out, because country is not on the view. Right? That could be my intended and desired outcome. I could also just say I want to only affect some worksheets. Right? If I want to only drill into Africa, I can watch the line chart on the left change, but not the scatter plot. Right? I could choose to have this filter only affect one worksheet. Likewise, I could also choose the legend to affect only one worksheet. So if I want to affect all worksheets, any of the controls can be configured to affect all worksheets. If I only want to affect some worksheets, one or more but not all worksheets, then any of the controls except for the highlighter can be configured to affect those. The next question we'll ask has to do with whether we need dynamic or static values. So do I need the selection values to update as my data update? If we come back to the parameter example earlier of a customer scorecard, those values you want to be constantly updating. You don't want to have to manually go reload that parameter with values. Right? You need your selection value to reflect the latest values in your database. So if I said, yes, I need dynamic values, probably if I'm looking at something over time, I want my time selection to include my most recent years of data. On the other hand, if I have a group of 3 metrics, if I'm looking at incidents, deaths, and fatality rates, those are not metrics that are changing as we progress through time. Right? These are established metrics that will probably persist in the future. Perhaps at a future date, when I come back to this dashboard for a revision, I add an additional metric. But I don't expect my selection values here to constantly or consistently change. Right? So in this case, just having 3 static values that I can choose from fits my needs. OK, so if I want static values, or rather, if static values will suffice for my needs, then I can use any of the controls. Any of the controls will work with static values. If I want dynamic values, then the only control that won't work is a parameter. Right? Next question has to do with cardinality. We already touched on this for legends. We can ask how many distinct values are there in the selection field. If I say not many, that means it's a low cardinality field. If we go back to our legend example, low cardinality works well for legends. In this case, I have 6 distinct regions, and I can see those colored here, and I can distinguish between those 6 different colors pretty easily. If I actually say there are a lot of distinct values in my selection field, that means it's high cardinality. Then in this case, with a legend, it's really difficult to tell anything by looking at the colors here. I can't look at this dot right here and before hovering over it know that it's Mozambique, because this legend is not helpful. Right? So if I have high cardinality fields, any of the controls except for a legend will work. If I have low cardinality fields, then all of the controls will work. The next question has to do with domain. Do we want our selection values to be pre-filtered? So if I'm looking at, again, my map of tuberculosis fatality rates, and then I want to drill into a specific region and then a specific country, let me select a region, and I can say I just want to look at Southeast Asia. And now, notice that my list of values, this list of countries to select on the right has filtered to those that are only in Southeast Asia, whereas my list of countries on the left is still all countries in the data set. So I could say, no, I don't need my selection values to be pre-filtered, right? I can just use all values in the database. That's fine. Or I could say, yes, I need only the relevant values, right? Only the values that remain after using other filters, right? So if I filter to region, I only want the countries, I only want to be able to select countries that exist in that region. Because watch what happens if I say, yeah, let's drill into Southeast Asia and Albania. I get nothing because Albania is not in Southeast Asia. Right? Whereas if I say, let's drill into Southeast Asia, and then that pre-filters my list, and I say, let's go look at Bangladesh and Bhutan, then because I knew that selecting from this list would provide me with a non-null data set returned, I can be assured that whatever I select will show something. So if I say, I just want to be able to select all values, I don't need to pre-filter that data set or pre-filter those selection values, then I can use an action, filter, or a parameter. So it's worthwhile to note that if you're using a highlighter or a legend, the highlighter or a legend will always be pre-filtered to the previous filter selections you've made. If I said I want relevant values, then I can use an action, filter, highlighter, or legend. The only one I can't use is a parameter. Because those values are static, those values do not depend on the actual data that you're working with. They're not a field. They're just a separate set of values entirely. So they can't detect other changes that would influence those values. Right? So parameters can't do relevant values. Right? And then the last question we're going to ask has to do with interface. What kind of user interface do we want? So I could say I want a drop-down, or I can select either a single selection or a multi-selection from a drop-down. I could say I just want a list where I can have this actually appear on the view to make it very apparent that there are different options to choose from. Or I could say I want a slider, right? If I say I want to just click between different options here. And lastly, I could say that I want a text entry. So if I search for, if I wait, am I on? All right, nope, not on. I'm good? OK, it's hard to tell up here. All right, so the last option for our interface is we could have just text entry, right? Kind of a search-style text entry. I could say, show me east, right? In which case I get Eastern Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. Right? In this case, I'm doing a wildcard match, returns anything that matches that string. So if I want to do a drop-down, I can use a filter or a highlighter or a parameter. If I want to do a list, I can use an action, filter, legend, or parameter. If I want to do a slider, I can use a filter or a parameter. If I want to do text entry, I can use a filter or a parameter. Or the other way of looking at this is filters have all of the UI options available to them, as do parameters. Actions, highlighters, and legends only have a single UI option. OK, so that's a lot of questions to think about at once. So let's actually walk through 3 case studies in which we put that decision tree into practice. So case number 1, I just want to narrow the scope of analysis by region. Now already this is a pretty straightforward one, and we could probably assume a filter will do the job. But just to take it all the way to the end, let's see if that makes sense. So I can start with asking, what is my purpose here? So the purpose is to filter. I want to narrow the scope. So let me select another error. Hold on. OK, let me select one more time. OK, let me select that I want to filter. And now I can see which controls allow me to do that. And more importantly, which don't. So highlighters and legends have already been grayed out. Those are not going to be possibilities. So the next question, do I need data encoding? Not really. I just want to be able to narrow the scope. I already have a nice view here. I don't need an additional data element. So I'll say, no, I don't need data encoding. Do I need multi-select or single select? Yeah, multi-select would be nice. I like to select adjacent regions. Do I need to apply this to all worksheets or just some worksheets? Yeah, I would like to apply it to all worksheets in the view. I would like to narrow the scope of the entire dashboard. So I'll say, let's do all worksheets. Do I need these values to be dynamic? Not really. The regions of the world don't change. They change even less often than the countries do. So we'll say static values will suffice. Dynamic would be fine too, but static would work. Is this high cardinality or low cardinality? 6 regions, that's a pretty small number, so this is low cardinality. And for the domain, do I need to pre-filter the available regions? No, it's really the first interactive action I expect users to take. So I don't need to pre-filter it. And even if I were to pre-filter it by saying, let's only narrow this to a certain range of years, all regions still exist in that range of years. So I'll just say I need all values. And finally, what kind of user interface do I want? So here I can see that if I were to select, say, a slider or text entry or dropdown, I get a filter. If I select a list, I actually have 2 options. I could do either an action, build my own worksheet and use an action with it, or I could just get a filter. But again, I don't really need additional data element or anything like that. I kind of want something subtle and out of the way, right? I don't want to impact this dashboard too terribly much. So I'll just choose a dropdown. So now it's very clear that, yes, we should be using a filter. So let's add that in here. So from the map, I'm going to drop down to filters and add in region. Now, by default, that comes in as a multi-select list, but I can just change this to single value or multiple value dropdown. Now, for dropdowns, I think one of the things that people are maybe not aware of is the opportunity to customize those. So here I can see, do I want to include that all value? So right now it says all regions, right? I can select all as an option. I could say, no, I want someone to, there's only 6 of them. They can click the regions they want. This maybe makes more sense when you have 2 values and you want to multi-select. Adding a third all value doesn't make sense when you would just be unchecking one or the other. But just to demonstrate, let's say don't show the all value. So now it's missing. Right? Another option here for customization is if I expect someone to be making a lot of changes and jumping back and forth, I don't necessarily want to issue a query to the data source every single time a selection is made. I just want to issue the query once the final selection is made. So I'll add an apply button, where now I can say, all right, let's just look at Eastern Mediterranean and Europe and apply. Okay, and then just one housekeeping item here. This isn't something you would necessarily encounter, but because I'm using Tableau to present Tableau and I'm semi-OCD, I'm going to make sure that we have a white background here to match. Okay. All right, so now we have our filter in place. The last thing we have to do, actually, last thing is we did say we want this to apply to everything. Right now, it's only applying to the map. So I'll drop down, apply to worksheets, all using this data source. Now, if you are using multiple data sources, then you can use the all using related data sources. And that's a feature new of 10.0 as well. It just looks at the blend relationships that are established between them and uses those to filter as well. But we only have a single data source here, so I'll just say all worksheets using this data source. OK, so now I've narrowed my scope of analysis, in this case, to one or more regions. So our second case study is to select from an alphabetic list of countries, and that selection highlights the map and scatter plot, but filters a line chart. All right, so this is a little more complex than what we did before. Let's start this back at the beginning and do it once more. So what do I want to do here? I want to select from an alphabetic list of countries that highlights the map and scatter plot, but filters the line chart. So I want to both highlight and filter. Right, so I want to filter and highlight at the same time. Already I can see there are only two options for that, actions or parameters. So now we have to figure out which one. So do I need data encoding? No, not really. I just said it needs to be an alphabetic list of countries. Do I want to be able to multi-select? Who thinks we should multi-select here? Raise your hands. Curious. No one thinks we should multi-select? OK, a couple of hands. Who thinks we should single select? Right, who abstained from voting? Not anymore, see? Raising your hand. So there could be a good argument made for either one. Multi-select would be fun in that we could compare multiple countries from the map to the scatter plot. I think my worry with that is that that line chart would become misleading, and then it would show combined for those two countries. And I would worry that someone would think they'd selected a couple countries and then look at that line chart and say, wow, look at how that's dropped over time. But in reality, it dropped in one country and overwhelmed the other. So to make sure we're being responsible, I'm just going to make this a single select. Right? Do I want to apply to all worksheets or some worksheets? All worksheets, doing different things to them, but applying to all worksheets. Do I need it to be dynamic or static? The countries aren't changing very often, so we'll do static. Is my cardinality low or high? Yeah, there's a lot of countries. That's a high cardinality. Do I need my domain to be all values or only the relevant values? All right, we're going to try this whole voting thing again. Who thinks we should do all values? Right? I can select, that list is always going to have all countries in it. Raise your hands. OK, a few more people this time. Who thinks we should do only the relevant values, meaning that the list of countries will only show values that are appropriate for the view? All right, we've made a good decision. So we're going to do only relevant values. Why? Because when I select a region from up here, I want that list of countries to update and only show me countries in that region. Right? So we have to keep in mind the interactivity we've already built in, which was that drop-down for region. So now we can see there's actually only one UI option available to me. And that's fine. I said I wanted an alphabetic list. So let's do a list. OK. So I need to use an action. But since I don't have an alphabetic list of countries already, also means I need to build a worksheet to use with that action. So let me build a new worksheet here. And in this worksheet, I just simply want a list of countries. So let me add in country. And this gives me a list of countries, but it's got this placeholder ABC text. This is telling me right now country is part of the header, and Tableau's waiting for me to actually give it data to use in the view. So what I can do is actually drag country again to text. And now I get kind of this double list of countries. But then I can actually click the drop-down on this pill, uncheck Show Header. And now I'm only getting the data in the pane. But in this case, the data is the country name. And now I have a list of countries. So let's take that and add it back into our dashboard. So going to take that country list. I actually want to add it next to the map. If I'm thinking about presentation and how in Western countries we read from left to right and top to bottom, I want them to read left to right tuberculosis fatality rates. They're going to see what this legend means, and then they're going to make a selection to narrow the scope. That's the first thing that's going to happen. After that, they're going to say, oh, I can continue to make a selection for a different country. Right, so I want this to make the second action they can take. So what I can do is normally I could hit this Use as filter, and we can start with this. This is a great way to build in really fast interactivity through actions. But what that's actually doing, if we go to Dashboard, Actions, is generating a pre-canned action. Right? Tableau's doing some settings for you based off this common need. But if I edit this, I can see what's really going on here. So for my source sheet, I have country list, and it's applied to all the others. Meaning if I were to click on this, it would filter all of the worksheets. Now, before we change this, why is that a bad thing? Well, one, it's not what we said we wanted to do. But other than that, it's also a bad idea, because if I said, show me Austria, right? The big thing here is that Austria is red. That looks awful. Wait, 6%. We lost all the context by filtering. Same with the scatter plot. Austria is in the upper right. Man, we should never go to Austria. Oh, wait. Those are pretty low values, actually. So we're losing that context. That's why we wouldn't want to filter anyway here. So how do I change it so that it doesn't filter? Let's go back to that action and edit it. So right now, we said selecting from the alphabetic list of countries highlights the map and scatter plot, but filters the line chart. So rather than target every worksheet, I just want to target the line chart, which is the chart that's over time. So I'm just going to change which worksheets I target here. So now if I do this and I select, again, Austria, right, only the line chart changes. But at this point, it looks like, if I just select Austria, it looks like this is the line chart for all of Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, which we selected before. But it's not. So the second part of this was to highlight. So now what we're going to do is actually add in additional action. And instead of adding in a filter action, we're going to add a highlight action. Where now I can say, clicking on the country list will target the map and the scatter plot. And I could take this a step further. I could say, clicking on the map or the scatter plot would actually highlight the country list too. Right? So I can actually say, let's use the map and scatter plot as source sheets as well. And again, this means I'm broadening my interactivity here. We're not just clicking on the list is what I want to do. Now clicking on any country or any mark in the scatter plot will highlight the scatter plot, map, and list. In this case, I'm going to be very specific and just say do it on country or territory name, mostly because I don't have region in this list here. So now watch what happens. If I say give me Austria, I get Austria highlighted there. It's really small. And I get it filtered here and highlighted here. Right? If I hover over Russia for more information and then say I want to see how this compares in the scatter plot, I get that as well. All right. But going back to that first case study where we said we want to filter, right? It does that. We filter by region, and then here when we click, we filter by country. But notice right now if I click Russia, the timeline doesn't change. So this is part of the process of working with actions where you have to go back through and iterate after each section of interactivity is added and think, how does this impact the previous interactivity I built in? So now I might go back here and say, oh, really, what I really wanted to do was not only click on the country list, but also click on the scatter plot or the map. So now I can say click on Russia, filter my time series, highlight my scatter plot. I could also say, what is this mark way up here? Somalia. Click on Somalia, highlight the map, filter my line chart. OK, so that was our second case study, right? Both highlighting and selecting from this list of countries. Now, I did say that I didn't need data encoding. I didn't need it. But would it be useful? The answer to that question is always yes. You should always have more data encoding. But you have to do it right. So in this case, I could say, yeah, let's actually show the header again. And instead of looking at a list of countries, let's just look at the overall fatality rate. I'm still going to keep this alphabetic, right, because I want to be able to search through it alphabetically. And now I can say, let's look at fatality rates. We're doing fatality rate on color 2. We're using one of the new color palettes in Tableau 10, which is our red gold. Right? So now I've got some increased data encoding here. If I go back to my dashboard, what's that look like? So this is starting to get a little bulky, and especially if we zoom out to the full screen. It's really starting to detract from that map. That map was kind of the primary focal point, the first real data element you see. And I want this list to play a role, but do I want it to play such an overwhelming role? I would say no, this is not what I want. So there are a couple things we can do here. We can make sure that this is small, right? Those bar charts are going to get a lot smaller. And you can kind of think of them the same way we think about spark lines. They're telling us information, but we're looking for large bars, not necessarily being able to look at that bar and be able to tell its numeric value. So now I can say, oh yeah, this view here tells me some good information, but it's not overpowering this one. Moreover, if I uncheck show header, if I actually configure this to not have a scroll bar across the bottom, which is really annoying, and fit width, now I've got something where I get these spark bars that tell me immediately that Afghanistan is a lot higher than these other countries that start with A. And then I can still click this and watch everything change. Now you could take this further. You could say what I really want to do here is not even have that bar chart, because that still takes up too much space and it's still too distracting. What I just want is something on color. And moreover, what I want is something on color with the country name. And I want that country name to blend in but still stand out, so I'll change the font to match the mark color. So now I get that list of countries. We can separate these with, say, a white border. A little bit of formatting. Whoops, not that. All these little tweaks that end up making essentially our own custom UI. And now if we go back to our dashboard, what we get is, again, a list of countries that can take up very little space, but still have that color encoding that matches the color encoding on the rest of the view. So again, being able to click into Afghanistan or any of the others. OK, so we do have one more case. So the third case here is, now that I have this list of countries, I want to be able to search that list of countries. There's a lot of countries. If I'm looking for Yemen, I don't want to scroll all the way down and hunt for Yemen. So what I'm going to do is, just from this country list, I'm going to add a filter for country. Now, by default, that's going to show up here in the upper right. And actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's back up. I already gave it away what I'm going to do. Pretend that didn't happen. But there are other questions here that we should answer. So purpose, filtering. Right? I want to filter that list of countries. Data encoding. No, I want to search for a country. Selection. Yeah, multi-select would be good. I want to search for countries that have similar names. I don't know. Is that valid? Probably not. So let's do single select. Just one country at a time is fine. Scope. All worksheets or some worksheets. Raise your hand if you think all worksheets. Raise your hand if you think some worksheets. Oh, this one we got wrong. So only some worksheets. I want to filter that list because I just want to search the list itself, not the other countries. So just some worksheets, just one worksheet. Do I need it to be dynamic? Again, countries don't change very often. So static is fine. High cardinality, yeah, there's a lot of countries. Domain, only the relevant values, because I just want the countries that are in a given region. User interface, I want text entry. I essentially want just a search icon that allows me to search for a country. Right? So I should do a filter, which I already did. And now what I'm going to do is take this filter and change it to be a wildcard match. And by default, since I brought it in from the country list worksheet, if I look at where it applies, only this worksheet, meaning the country list worksheet. So that's good. So it has the functionality I want right now. So if I search for Yemen, right? Yemen pops up, and I can click it to keep using the interactivity I've already built in. Now, the only other thing I would do here would be to place this closer to this country list to make it obvious that I'm only searching the list. So I'm going to add in a vertical layout container. Forgive me, I forgot to log into the Wi-Fi. So the map keeps not popping up. And then inside that vertical layout container, I'm going to place my search tool. Now, notice that this is not filling out all of that vertical layout container. So let's fit, see if we can make this fit width again. Okay, let's pull it down. So now, if I do a little bit of formatting, hide the title, right, I can also hopefully not necessarily need the instructions to search. Maybe that box will be apparent enough. Maybe it won't. So maybe I'll change this to search by country. And now what I can do is, again, type in whatever country I'm looking for. Get that country as it pops up, and then click through it to highlight. OK, so that was our third case study, being able to search the list on the view. So that concludes our 3 case studies, and actually concludes my presentation. If this is something that you found useful, I recommend these related sessions. So tomorrow we have Gorilla usability for your dashboards, authoring for interactivity, and parameters, a love story. So definitely recommend those. This was, I think, maybe a good primer on the different controls we offer. These sessions will go a lot deeper, hopefully. All right, thank you very much for coming. And please remember to fill out the survey in the app. Thank you.